Hey there everybody, it's Mark Crilley. I'm back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about supporting characters. This is my latest video in a series in which I offer all my best advice on writing and the creative process. And as you can see, I've decided to do a little drawing of Jessie from Toy Story 2 and 3. A very good example of a supporting character, I believe. And as I work on this, I'm going to go ahead and give you 10 different pieces of advice. So let's go ahead and get into it. This first one is, number one, it is extremely hard to tell a story with no supporting characters since your main character is left with no one to talk to. This conversation partner role is a crucial part of the supporting character's job. So yes, if you look back through the history of great stories, very few of them have just a single character. I would say Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway is the first example that comes to mind. But even in that movie, you see that he starts talking to a soccer ball, Wilson. And that is, in a way, I think, an acknowledgement of the importance of supporting characters. And I didn't really think about it until I got older, but a lot of it is about just giving the character someone to have a conversation with, and during these conversations, a lot of important information comes out, and just makes the story more fun. So most people, I think, have an instinct for adding supporting characters, but I think once you're aware of this conversational role, it maybe will help you in the way that you deploy these characters in the story. Let's move on to number two. If you introduce a supporting character early in the story and then never bring them back, the audience may feel that you forgot about them. The more supporting characters you introduce, the harder it becomes to keep giving them all something to do in the story. So yeah, that is there is sort of an expectation of once you introduce a character that you will bring them back, and not just have them be isolated in that first scene or second scene or wherever you had them. This does not apply to minor characters, and I may do a separate video that's about truly minor characters who can indeed just sort of pop in for one brief little scene and be gone. But just another thing to be aware of. If you introduce a character, especially introduce them with a certain amount of fanfare, and then you leave them out of the rest of the plot just because you have become distracted or more interested in some other character than that one that you introduced, the readers may sort of begin to wonder, what happened? Was it a mistake? Why did you not bring that character back? So something to keep in mind. Let's move on to number three. A supporting character can be an important source of information, allowing you to inform the reader of backstory, etc. But you should make sure that they are more than just an exposition mouthpiece. I always like to quickly explain what the word exposition means for anyone who doesn't know. That's when you're really just giving information straight to the audience in a very direct way of someone just standing there and telling you something about the backstory or about a character. And generally speaking, you should avoid prolonged moments of exposition. You want to sort of gracefully get information to the audience without, beating them over the head with it. You want them to be able to put two and two together and stuff like that. And sometimes a supporting character, it becomes all too clear that the only reason they're in the story is to provide this backstory or to do this long speech in which they explain the rules of the world or whatever. Be cautious about that. Supporting characters are great for getting exposition into your story in a graceful way, but it has to be graceful, and you have to also, have them actually doing things in the story, and have them. You don't want them to just be a sort of a mouthpiece, someone who gives information and does nothing else that's central to the plot. It's going to take a long time to draw all these little strands of hair. What was I thinking? Why did I choose Jessie? Oh, right. That's because she's a great supporting character. She really is, and hopefully she'll come up as an example later on. Let's go on to number 4 here. If the supporting character is a sidekick for the main character, you may want to think of them more as a co-lead. They should have their own backstory and be fully integrated into the plot. So yeah, the idea of a sidekick character, I think, is an elevated form of supporting character, and they have to be treated with more, I don't want to say more respect, but you have to just give them more to do. You have to really weave them into the story. I think, in my case, as an example, I would say Brody's Ghost. Hang on a second, I'll show who I'm talking about here. In Brody's Ghost, Brody is the main character, this guy here, but his so-called ghost, Talia, is, I would say, a kind of a sidekick character. Once she's introduced in this first scene in the story, she's never far from the plot. I mean, she's at his side for many of the key scenes, and I would say she's, almost a co-lead in that regard. So when you decide to have a character that's going to be a sidekick, sort of like Watson to Sherlock Holmes or that kind of thing, you have to really, think about their backstory, make sure they've got a defined personality, because, you've given them extra responsibility by giving them that sidekick role. Let's move on to the next one. Number 5. Supporting characters generally have a personality that contrasts with the main character. So definitely, in the case of Brody's Ghost, I did that for sure. This Talia character is very sort of sassy and she's got a lot of irreverent, she's always saying a lot of things that are sort of actually kind of hard-hearted, or she just seems to view the world in a more callous way than Brody does. And definitely you don't want to have the main character and the supporting characters be too similar. And indeed, sometimes what you're going for is a deliberately contrasting, drastically different oil and water kind of comparison between the two characters, which can, result in comedy and so forth. It just makes everything more interesting. So if you've got supporting characters that are quite similar to your main character, you may want to revisit that decision and see if you can make them a little more different one way or another from the main character. Number 6. Introducing a new supporting character midway through the tale can be a good way of injecting new energy into a story that has become more of the same. Yeah, that's an interesting thing that you see happen sometimes, and I think Jessie actually is a pretty good example of that. If you kind of have to think of the Toy Story movies as those first 3 as one huge story altogether, and if that is the case, then Jessie becomes this new character that comes along halfway through and makes things more interesting. And indeed, she has a very thoroughly worked out backstory, doesn't she? They made sure with that song in Toy Story 2 that we find out what she went through, what motivates her point of view on all of this stuff. And definitely, I think, brings a new energy to Toy Story. If you imagine Toy Story 2 not having had Jessie or Bullseye or Stinky Pete, then you're looking at a less interesting movie. I mean, that's it was, you could almost feel this breath of fresh air come into the Toy Story universe as soon as we got these 3 new characters added in. So if you're telling a story and you feel like it's kind of losing gas, consider working in a fresh new character halfway through. In a way, just that position of them having not been there from the beginning automatically gives them that sort of energy injecting property. Something to keep in mind. And let's move on now to number 7. If I can pick up the piece of paper. And it says, you can get away with a supporting character being a little one-dimensional, but the longer they remain in the story, the more you'll need to flesh them out. So yeah, in my case, I in the past have had characters that were fairly one-dimensional. In my Akiko comic book story, there was this kind of team of Spuckler, the wild cowboy character who just did whatever he felt like doing, and he used poor grammar and so forth. And then we had Mr. Biba, who was much more straight-laced, and the two of them, they fought with one another and so forth, but they were kind of one-dimensional. When you first met them, you thought, oh, this is the librarian character, this is the kind of rough, wild adventure type character. But as I continued to tell more and more stories that involved these guys, I did have to flesh them out more. It did not... it would not be satisfying to have them remain these sort of one-note characters. So in a way, I think it is related to the length of time that we have these characters around, the degree to which it becomes important to show some other side to that character and not have them just be a kind of a stereotype or a cliche. Let's move on now to number 8. If you're not careful, your supporting characters can end up being more interesting and popular than your main character. Trying to turn them into the new main character is a very hard trick to pull off. I think one that immediately comes to mind is the Jack Sparrow character in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. He was a side character in the first one, and he became very popular. People really reacted to that character, and the producers of the film clearly could not resist going back to the well and indeed transforming him into the kind of the main character. It can be very tricky. I haven't seen so many of those movies, but I have certainly heard that a lot of people have problems with that Jack Sparrow character becoming the main character. Back when I was a kid, and this is showing how old I am really, that they had this Happy Days TV show and a character named the Fonz, who was, again, he was this supporting character, but he became so popular that, again, they kept sticking him in and turning him into the main character. It's a hard thing to do. I think it's, in a way, best to leave these supporting characters as the supporting characters they were always meant to be, and not try to milk them for all they're worth. So anyway, something to keep in mind, and in a way, it may, if you have a supporting character that's way more interesting than your main character, that's maybe a sign that you need to work on your main character and make them a little more interesting. And it's not so much a problem with your, supporting character is too interesting, it's that your main character isn't interesting enough to hold their own. But I do think there's a tradition of the main character not being too flashy. If you look at The Wizard of Oz, for example, Dorothy is a sort of an every-girl character. And we leave it to the Tin Man and the Scarecrow and all these other ones to be the colorful, wild, interesting, visually dazzling characters. No one would say that about Dorothy. That's not. Sometimes the main character is meant to be a little more subdued. Well, I am coming down to my last 2 pieces of advice, but as always, I'd like to finish up my drawing a little more before I end the video. So give me just a moment. I'm going to use a little time lapse to finish up this drawing of Jessie, and then we'll be back with advice 9 and 10. Alright, well, I think we've got enough of the drawing done that we can move on to these last 2 pieces of advice. And number 9 is this. In stories... Oh, joy! She always has to get into these videos now. Something. She must have seen a squirrel. Number 9. In stories that are super serious, a supporting character can be a good source of comic relief. Beware, though, of these characters turning out to be annoying rather than funny. So, a supporting character is very often used as comic relief. Even in stories that aren't super serious, they sort of designate, this is the comic relief character. And I've just noticed as a consumer of entertainment, you got to be real careful with these so-called comic relief characters, because it can really backfire badly if the character is not genuinely funny. There's a thing with comedy. We go very quickly from thinking something is funny to thinking it's annoying. And so be real cautious about that. I prefer to have all of the characters have humorous aspects to them, and not to have a single character be the obvious attempt at a comic relief character. But in any case, something to focus on. If you've got a really heavy story, maybe you do need one or two characters in there that can lighten things up a little bit. And now we move on to the 10th and final piece of advice here. A friendly supporting character can be a good disguise for the secret villain of the story. Be careful, though, that you've given them a good reason for betraying the protagonist, and that you aren't just throwing in a twist for the sake of it. So yeah, in terms of having a surprise, oh, that was the bad guy type of a moment, generally speaking, you can hide that character in among one of these seemingly friendly, supportive characters, but it really does require thinking it through and figuring out, what is it that caused this character to want to turn against their friend. And that just requires a lot of thought on your part, almost before you even write the story. What could they have done, the main character that was perceived by this other character as something that wronged them or got them angry enough that they would pretend to be the friend and then later on turn out to be the villain of the piece. So yeah, that's it can be a good technique, but it does require, I think, a careful planning. Now, before I end the video, I want to announce the name of my very next book coming out in September. It is called The Two-Pencil Method, and I'm going to go ahead and do the reveal of the front cover right now. All right, so there you see, it's the two-pencil method, and it's even got my dog, Joy, the corgi, right there on the front cover. As the title suggests, it's all about my two-pencil method of making pencil drawings, starting with an ordinary number 2 sort of writing pencil, finishing things off with a black colored pencil, and it's going to cover all sorts of pencil drawing topics. I'll be talking more about that, and of course giving a full reveal of the interior of the book once I get one of my complimentary copies. But for now, let me go ahead and lay down this pencil. I want to say thanks to all of you who watched this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.